Let's take a look at Fuji's X-T4. The reason people love the Fujifilm cameras, myself as well, is because they have real metal knobs and dials. They're not plastic rubbish, and they are not simply menus and function buttons. Each button or dial has only one function for the most part, and you can set what you want to set. If you want program exposure mode, you set both the lens and the body to A. If you want to force a shutter speed, say you suddenly want to make water look smooth, boom, just nail that to a 30th. You're now in a shutter priority mode. If you want aperture priority, again, just set your lens, presuming your lens provides this function, to the aperture you want, and everything is automatically swapped over. It's got a thread for real cable release, so you don't have to buy the fancy ones. It's got a real ISO dial. The problem with these cameras is that a defect in design is while it has big clicks for each of these third stops that nobody needs, all you really need are the full stops. It has no setting above 12-800 or below 160. You can't get to the 125, 100, or 80 pull ISOs, and you can't get to the 25-600 or 51-200 ISOs unless you go back to the control menu or dials or whatever. So the whole point of this fancy dial, I think, is fairly moot. I don't use it, which is really too bad. What it should have is a full stop. Each of these clicks should be a full stop and should have every one of the ISOs, not just a subset. This dial for adjusting your viewfinder is pretty fidgety. This is a very tiny little plastic dial, and it's hard to get to, and it's hard to feel. I don't like that, but what is good is that the finder is huge. It's a huge finder. It's sharp, it's bright, it's clear, and the finder is one of the best things about this camera, along with all the mechanical dials and controls. Also, what's marvelous is, and I'm not going to bother to show you here on YouTube because the sound really doesn't transfer over through YouTube by the time it gets to your little speakers and the way I process my audio, but the sound of the shutter, the mechanical shutter, is beautiful. It has no vibration, it is smooth, it is quiet, it is better than a silent shutter because it's just enough to let you know that it went off, and it sounds so smooth and so wonderful. It really affirms the fact that you bought a quality camera, which is why many people buy these Fujifilm cameras. It's not so much about the pictures. What really makes these cameras stand out is the way they feel in your hand. Also, another dedicated control here for the advanced mode. Just click this along. It does its thing. We also have a dedicated dial here for still or movie mode. The earlier X-T3, this was a meter mode switch, so that's different. That's the main thing to know about this camera that are good, and the reason people love it. The reason to hate it is Fuji's menu system is just as bad as Sony's, which are tied for the worst in the industry. They're confusing, malorganized, things aren't really written or clearly, so good luck. These cameras, I've been shooting them since the X series first came out in 2010, and I'll admit, setting up the menus is always frustrating. You never really learn it. You think you learn it, and then something changes, and it's hideous. The good news is once you get your menus set up, you rarely need to go in them because for the most part, most of your shot-to-shot settings are set with these. Or there is a little cue screen you can hit by doing that. One of the weirdnesses about this camera, which has yet to been fixed, is when you turn this dial in your cue screen, things go the wrong way. In fact, let's see if I can show you that while we're here live on television. Good. Suppose you want to set color. I always set my color up to the maximum. If I want to turn it this way to go up, you'll notice it actually goes down. You think that's confusing now? It's even more confusing when you're trying to shoot and kids are moving. That's bad. But hey, that's Fujifilm. What's new about this camera compared to the X-T3 is it adds in-body sensor shift stabilization that a lot of amateurs get all excited about. I don't, because the best stabilization comes from the lens. With an ultra-wide lens, sensor shift stabilization only works in the center. It can't work in the sides unless you have a rubber sensor that moves more in the corners than it does in the center because of the way the geometry works with ultra-wide lenses. And with really long lenses, it doesn't work well with sensor shift because the sensor just can't move far enough. So it's a minor feature, and actually, when I test this a little further down, it doesn't work that well. A key thing to know before you buy into the Fujifilm system is it has a very different look than other brands of cameras. If we take Sony as a relatively neutral look, Sony's are very accurate but not particularly exciting. I always like to set my saturation up as well as my sharpening. I prefer my Nikon and Canon cameras for photographs of everything except people because I can get much brighter colors out of Nikon or Canon than I can get from the Fujifilms. My Fujifilm cameras always seem stuck on a permanent portrait mode. The colors are more muted and more subtle, which makes people look wonderful under any light, but they look really dull and drab for nature and landscape photos. So I don't recommend these for nature and landscape, but certainly for people in portrait, they are fantastic. Autofocus works great on this camera. It just automatically finds eyes and faces and multiple groups, and it just gets your picture, which is good. What's new since the X-T3? I covered sensor shift stabilization. Fujifilm rates it at 6.5 stops improvement, which is the most I've ever seen claimed. Doesn't work that well. It's got a huge battery. Another great feature is, look at this beast. It's the size of a DSLR battery. And the great thing is it's now rated for 600 shots, and I have no reason to doubt that it really does give 600 shots, although I've never been able to run it down. Shutter speeds can be set directly if you do it in the menus by setting it to the T position and then going along here. Can I do this? Yeah. It'll go straight down to 15 minutes, which is something I think all cameras should do. They should actually go longer. Autofocus is now rated to light value -6 compared to light value -3. This runs at 15 frames per second with its mechanical shutter, up from the old X-T3's 11 frames per second. Fujifilm claims a quieter mechanical shutter. It's a beautiful mechanical shutter, but I don't recall the X-T3 being that bad. It weighs 1.3 ounces, or 37 grams, more than the old X-T3, but that's because of the bigger battery. But when you add the bigger battery and the body, it weighs 2.4 ounces, or 68 grams more than the old X-T3. It's just a little bit bigger in some dimensions by a millimeter or so, but not that much. What's also kind of funny is, if you shoot the other camera, you can't shoot these interchangeably unless you reprogram the buttons, which is not that bad to do because this AE lock, AF on, and Q for quick screen button, they moved one position counterclockwise. The LCD now has more dots than the old one. That doesn't matter. There's a new Eterna bleach bypass mode in the film simulations. It's now USB 3.2, up from USB 3.1 in the old X-T3. A big negative compared to the X-T3 is that the X-T3 includes this marvelous EF X8 folding shoe mount flash that comes right here. And it's a beautiful thing. It just flips up and down to turn itself on and off. And it's powered from the camera's battery. It's not included. It's now a $40 extra. Also, what's bad compared to the X-T3 is the X-T3 at least had an H and an L setting on the ISO dial, which you had to program in your menus as to which of the H or L high or low push or pull settings you wanted to be represented at that spot on the dial. Well, to alleviate confusion, Fujifilm simply took those off on the X-T4, which means they took something bad and made it worse. But who am I to say? There used to be a very nice little door on the side to cover these connectors, and now these are crummy little rubber flaps. Although the crummy little rubber flaps are such that they do tend to, if you have to shoot in the rain and the drizzle, it may keep some rain or drizzle out, but that's what these are. These are now these two crummy little flaps, which experience has told me after about 10 years, these will start to fall off. This will break, and then you'll keep pushing it on, and then you'll lose it, but yeah, that's just the way it is. No more headphone jack. There's only so much space in these little Japanese cameras. Now, instead of a headphone jack, you've got a USB-C jack, and you should be able to use a USB-C to headphone adapter, and it should work just great. Some good things about this camera. The in-body sensor shift stabilization, I don't think it's the best. I'd rather use in-lens, but so what? You don't have to use it. It's there. Manual exposures go all the way out to 15 minutes. Fujifilm includes the 4-way rear controller here, as they should. Many of the other Fujifilm cameras, including their $10,000 GFX medium format cameras, have removed these and force you into using these dopey touch functions. Thank goodness you've got the real controller here, and if you want to use the dopey touch functions, you can use those too. Image quality is highly optimized to people. Skin tones, people from anywhere on Earth, really look really good in any kind of light on the Fujifilm cameras. It's got brilliantly precise all-metal construction for a man who likes to have a well-made camera. This is it. I don't find the Leicas to be made any better than these Fujifilm cameras. It's also got a dedicated lever I didn't show on the front here yet for autofocus modes, just like a real camera, because it is a real camera. You've got manual, continuous, and single-shot autofocus. It's got a full 250th of a second flash sync speed. The diopter adjustment locks. It never moves itself around in practice. It's got Wi-Fi and it's got Bluetooth if you ever use those. What's bad? Well, it's got the same awful, atrocious menu system as all the other Fujifilm cameras. To be honest, when the Fujifilm X series first came out in 2010, I gave them a pass because the X100 was such a brilliant little and uniquely well thought out camera that I gave them a pass for the crummy menu system, assuming that it would be improved over time. No, it's actually gotten worse over time as they throw more stuff in there in random places. So that's a big crutch. And the reason I don't like the Fujifilm cameras is the menus are awful. It takes you forever to get them set up. But once you do, it's really quick to operate because of these dials. Another bad thing is this is offshore to China. It's not quality made in Japan. Offshore to China, and that's a real concern for me. I don't really enjoy buying cameras made in China, at least not paying top dollar for them. What's missing? There's no built-in flash. To be honest, I prefer my X-T30, which has exactly the same sensor and technical image quality. because it has a built-in flash. I just pop a button. It's always with me. And to be honest, having a built-in flash makes a significant improvement in pictures when you're working in harsh light or doing people photography. If you're not going to use a shoe mount flash, you really need to have that built-in flash. Oddly, what's also missing is there is auto ISO and it's fully programmable, except that you don't have a control when you use the automatic selection of the slowest shutter speed based on the focal length of the lens. You can't offset it to be either faster or slower than 1 over the focal length of the lens. What is weird about this camera is, and it's not hard to understand once I explain it, is that these are locking controls. They're actually push-push. You'll notice you push them once, they go in, push them out. If you can see that little gray, you're unlocked. If you push them in, then you're locked. It's unusual and it's unique among all brands of cameras. It's not that you push it to unlock it and then let it go to relock. It's basically either locked or unlocked. And the shutter dial's that way, as is the ISO dial. Strange but true. But as soon as you figure it out, you got it down. It takes a moment longer to wake up than I would expect from a premium camera. That's a bit of a bummer. In other words, every time you tap this after it goes to sleep or turn it back on, it takes a little bit longer than I would like. The automatic brightness control for the finder is still poor. It only seems to have 2 levels, which is either too bright or too dark. The display back button isn't marked on the button. This is pretty obvious here in studio lighting when close up, but in actual use, when it gets darker out, if you hit for where it says display back, you're not hitting the button, you're hitting the sides. See, that's a little bit something to learn. Most of the other buttons are all marked on the button. The play button is on the wrong side. Now, you can reprogram other buttons to be play, but the key is, every time you hit this, you need another hand. For one-handed shooting, it's really inconvenient, and that play button should be over here someplace. The exposure compensation dial is wonderful to have. It's a little stiff, and it's a little hard to reach. To be honest, they really should make it extend a little bit further over so you could reach it better. But there's no deeper detent at 0, so you can't just feel when you're at 0. When you set ISOs, I wind up having to use the menu system because you can't get to all the ISOs here. Let's see if I can do a quick thing. Set it to C, that means command dial. And now when you run this command dial in the front, here's the problem. Let's say you're an auto ISO. And again, there's 3 auto ISO settings. So when you set it to A here, you have whatever auto ISO setting you happen to be out of the 3. You still need to go into these menus. Okay, here's your auto ISO settings. So normally, you shoot an auto ISO. And if it's not doing it for you, you want to set it manually. You use that setting, go into manual. But here's the problem. The first thing you hit out of the auto ISOs is ISO 51,000. That's not what you want. That's also really bad because if you're shooting and accidentally knock it from auto, boom, you get really 51,000 ISO photos when you least expected it. The way it should be designed is when you come out of auto, you should be hitting auto at this end of the scale. So the first thing you hit is ISO 80, 100. In other words, 200 ISOs you'd actually be using and not the crazy ISOs. That's a defect. Also, you should have the ability to get to auto ISO at the other side of these settings. In other words, what you're seeing is I'm turning this dial here, but that's not the way it's programmed. The SD card slots are backwards. By backwards, I mean that number 1 is on the bottom and number 2 is on the top. I mean, who does these things? The flimsy card door, this is a card door and it's bad. You have to use your fingernail and get into that and fiddle around with it. Man-sized card doors, I love the ones on my Nikons and my Canons that usually just pull back and they just flop open, and they never flop open by accident. Big, meaty card doors that are easy to get to. This one is a bit fidgety. These A's are too dark. Here in my studio with studio lighting, it's very easy to see them because they're highlighted and the contrast and everything is turned up. But in the field, especially if you're in mediocre lighting, these are more of a dark burgundy and they're really hard to see. High ISOs. Here are complete images shot on the X-T4. And it's self-explanatory. The lowest ISO at ISO 80 is actually pulled ISO so that the highlights are more contrasty or they'll clip depending on your point of view. The X-T4 is okay, but it is not great. I would say it's worse than average for high ISOs because it looks fine at reasonable ISOs. But you'll notice when we get to ISO 25,600 and ISO 51,200, the color shifts. That's not acceptable, at least not today in 2020. It used to be that things got really weird at the higher ISOs, but today, most better cameras don't do weird things with the colors at higher ISOs, and the fact that these subtle shifts are happening, that's a variable that we don't need when we're out shooting for a living. The real differences in high ISOs are seen when we zoom in here. These are very high magnifications. These are 10 times magnifications. These are 600 by 450 pixel crops. At the lowest ISO, you'll see that the highlights are a little bit washed out, but it's also the sharpest. As we go up in ISO, You'll notice the finer details are smudged over by the noise reduction, which is normal. Every camera does that. And as we get to the very highest ISOs, as is typical for all digital cameras, including the Leica Q2, is that the fine details simply go away because the noise reduction system is doing its darndest to get rid of every last little speck of gray as best it can, and it's taking away half the picture with it. So other than the fact that the color shifts, which really is suboptimal today, it works just fine at any reasonable ISO you would want to use. Although, to be honest, technically, it has the same sensor and the same performance as the X-T30, which costs a lot less. Auto white balance works well, as most of these mirrorless cameras have done for quite some time. Mechanically, as I said at the top, everything is metal. The ISO dial, the top cover, the shutter speed dial, the shutter button, the on-off switch, this compensation dial, the strap lugs, the camera back through here, and the bottom cover all metal. What's plastic? These lock buttons are plastic. The advanced mode control, which is this thing here, this is plastic. The still movie mode control, this is plastic. The front focus mode lever, this is plastic. The frame of the LCD, this part is plastic. The side card door and the bottom battery door, these are also plastic. Rubbery plastic are these side connector covers. These little flaps, kind of rubbery. The grip covering's a little bit semi-rubbery. And the bottom grip connector cover, this little flap here, this is rubber, and this pops out. And as I said, it is made in China. For image stabilization, I was not impressed. I only got 4 or 5 stops of real-world image stabilization using this lens, the 16 to 80 millimeter f4, at let's say 35 millimeters, just as a for instance. I got 100% perfectly sharp tripod equivalent shots, handheld at a 2/50th of a second without the stabilization. And 75% of the time, I got complete, perfect, 100% tripod equivalent sharpness at a 1/25th. When I turned the stabilization on, I got perfect sharpness 100% of the time in an eighth of a second, which sounds great. But to be honest, that's nowhere near 6 stops of stabilization. And my Canon EOS R with the 24 to 105 STM lens gets even better stabilization, and it doesn't even have sensor shift stabilization. So stabilization works well, but it's not an end-all reason to have to buy a new camera. Playback, it's got a color histogram on playback, but it doesn't have one while you're shooting, which is a defect in the Fujifilm cameras. The EOS R series of Canon has that. For data, the cards aren't formatted properly. Fuji's never done this well. Specifically, they're titled as untitled, which doesn't sound like a big deal. It almost sounds humorous. Oh, they titled as untitled. Isn't that funny? But when I come back from a job and plug all my cards into my card readers and my Macintosh's Finder shows me what's up there with all my external drives and everything else going on, I don't need something saying untitled. I need to say something like EOS Digital, which is what my Canons say, or my Nikons will say like Nikon D5 or Nikon D6. That's unacceptable. They really should say Fuji X-T4, but that's the way it is. There's a very well hidden battery percentage readout. It's a secret in most of the Fuji cameras. It only appears when you're in the shooting mode and only in this data screen. It's only this little number right here. You can never see it in the Finder. You can never see it on playback, and you can never see it during menus. Simply tap the shutter to get the shooting mode and tap the display back button a few times until you get to the data screen, and then you can get your battery percentage indicator. And those are a few thoughts about the Fuji X-T4. For the full report, as always, the full written definitive report is up at kenrockwell.com. And I thank you for watching me here on kenrockwell.tv.